Hi everyone, this is Neil. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'll be painting this Dreamy Night Sky. We're going to paint this right on paper without any sketch, so let's go over the colors that I'll be using. I have here Moonglow by Daniel Smith, Quin Rose by Holbein, Quin Red by Daniel Smith, Mineral Violet by Holbein, Cerulean Blue by Holbein, Buff Titanium by Daniel Smith, and Chinese White by Holbein. I'll also be using gouache paints, so here I have Primary Yellow by Winsor & Newton Designer Gouache, and I also have white. This is Himi gouache, but you can also use the Winsor & Newton. And I have two whites here. The other one is by Dr. P.H. Martins, and this is the bleed proof white. This is supposed to be very opaque, and I'm going to use this towards the end to make the stars glow a little bit more. For the paper, I'll be using Arches. This is a 300 GSM fine grain that I masked around the sides. And before we begin, I'm just going to prepare my materials. I have my paint, water, and brushes ready, and I'm also going to break apart some tissue and place it right next to me. This is for lifting the cloud shapes later, and I'm also going to have a couple of sheets of tissue to control the load of my brush as well. I'm going to begin by wetting the surface. I want the water to be evenly distributed and not too heavy, since I am still going to be adding wet paint on top of this, so the paper will have more water. But the most important thing at this point is to not have one area that is going to dry before other parts, because that will create a blooming texture that I don't really want for this painting. Once I have the water evenly distributed, I'm going to start with Buff Titanium. This is such a nice soft color, and I'm going to use this to indicate the placing of the clouds roughly on paper, so I don't have to paint the negative spaces instead with the sky, and this way it's easier to visualize once we incorporate the colors. Here I feel like I have a fairly good idea of the positions for the clouds, so I'm going to start painting the sky starting from the top left, and for this I used a mixture of Quin Red with white to create a really cute pastel pink color. Then I'm going to follow this up with a mix of Mineral Violet with Moonglow and white. I'm using a medium to thick consistency because with the amount of water on paper it's still going to fade quite a bit, so I want it to be as thick as I can make it without compensating the ease of application. In terms of the placement, I do try to leave out a little bit of white around the Buff Titanium clouds, and this will give the paint a bit of space to spread out naturally. I also try to make the uneven edges of the clouds while applying the purple mix, and with the wet on wet technique, this will really help to create the soft edges. As I get towards the bottom of the sky, I'm going to introduce the cerulean blue, and I'm just going to go back and forth with the colors of the sky to fill some lighter areas with a thick consistency of the color, and also move the paint around to create a gradual gradient from those colors. So the top left is more pinkish, middle is purple, and the bottom is more bluish. And as you can see, as I create the gradual gradient, I try to always go back and forth with the colors to blend it in a bit better. So where the pink and the purple is joining together, I try to mix both of those two colors in between. And I'm also going to do that towards the bottom where the blue is. I'm working fairly fast here because I want the paper to still be wet since I need to lift the colors. I think that this is the key to this painting or any wet on wet technique. It's basically to understand how to keep the paper wet without it puddling, to be able to keep using the wet on wet technique. Just keep this in mind, because once you understand the distribution of water and how much is enough, it was much easier for me to control how much water I need for these looser paintings. So as you can see here, I can start to see the separation between the clouds and the sky. So I took the small bit of tissue that I broke off and roll it very loosely, and I'm using this by rotating my wrist and playing with the angle to create random edges to get the fluffy cloud texture. This is very important to roll loosely because you want the edges to be randomized, whereas if the tissue is rolled too tightly and it becomes a bit too dense, it's harder to get those soft random edges that you see here. If you've used up one part of the tissue and it's no longer absorbing the paint, feel free to roll the other edges or get a new one. The key here is to get those soft edges in most of the sides of the clouds, and if I accidentally take off too much paint, I just go back in with a bit of color to fill it in again and then create those soft edges. You can also create softer wispy cloud textures by loosening the tissue and putting very little pressure on the wet paint. So you can practically call this done now. It does look like clouds in the sky, but it's fairly bright, so it looks more like daytime, and I want this to be darker since I want to create a night sky. And I'm going to first add darker clouds, so I'm going to mix in Quinrose with Moon Glow to create a muted pinkish purple color, and I want the bottom to be the darkest area, and as I get towards the top of the sky, I want to turn the color a bit lighter. So for the top, I added buff titanium to create more like a pastel tone of the same pinkish purple. The way I'm applying the paint is with quite a heavy load. I don't want any part to dry off as I'm painting this. And you can also do this in small portions or small areas at a time, so you make sure that it stays wet since I'm going to lift it further. As I get towards the tip, as the pink is fairly wet, I'm just adding a bit of buff titanium to soften the edges and let that pink sort of travel softly towards the buff titanium. And once I'm done here, I'm just going to lift it up further with the tissue to create those edges that I'm looking for, because as you can see previously with just the brush application, the edges look a little bit out of place. So I'm just going to keep going back and forth with the colors. And here I added the darker purple using the Moon Glow by itself, because again, I do want to create that gradual transition from a dark purple to that soft pastel pink. I'm just going to keep doing this until I get the color range that I'm looking for, so it balances out with the rest of the painting. I'm just going to leave the bottom left side to dry off slightly as the paper is very wet, and at this point it won't really take any more paint. So moving on to the bottom right side, I'm going to apply the same color but a bit softer this time with a mix of Quinrose and Moon Glow, so as before, but with the addition of buff titanium. And I'm going to apply this the same way as I did on the left side with a heavy load, but I don't want this to be as intense, which is why I added the buff titanium. But I do want this color to gradually fade into a softer pink towards the top, and once I'm done applying it, I'm going to go back with my tissue and lift some of the paint on the edges, and even in the middle if I feel like I can still create somewhat of a cloud texture. I'm going to leave that part to dry now, and I'm going to be working on the top right hand side, and because that part has already dried off, I wet the surface a little bit with water, but as you can see, the water also reacted with the sky color, so I'm just going to fix that later on, but just work on the surface while it's still fairly wet. I'm just doing the same thing as before, but this time I use a pinkish color rather than a dark purple from a mixture of Quin Red and buff titanium. Now to fix some of the sky that I messed up before, I'm just going to lift the color while the paint is activated, and I'm just going to treat this as a soft cloud using the same technique with less pressure. Now I'm going to go back into the bottom left hand side and I'm going to add Moon Glow, as it's a very dark purple compared to the rest, and I'm just going to softly blend it towards the top, creating a more exaggerated gradient. As you can see, the top part was still fairly wet, that's why the paint is reacting that way. So I'm actually just going to wait for this to completely dry before I move on. I'm just going to work on parts that I can work on, so I'm lifting more of the edges. I'm also going to try to do this for the bottom right hand side and also the top right. I'm trying to rotate the parts that I can work on so each section has more time to dry off. But at this point, I knew from looking at the bloom texture on the bottom left that I wouldn't be able to work on it further, so after layering more colors where I can, I decided to leave the whole painting and eat lunch, so it had plenty of time to dry off, which made the layering process much easier as I would be able to treat it as normal paper. So from here on, you will see that the colors are just faded. This is after I left it to dry for an hour or so. You can also use a hair dryer for this, but drying naturally would have more even texture sometimes. So I'm just going to work on the same parts again to build up the colors. The mixtures are basically the same, but I just keep layering the colors until I'm fairly happy with the vibrancy and contrast of value. I'm going to leave out the clouds for now, and I'm going to build on the colors of the sky. For this, I'm going to be very careful with how I apply the paint because I don't want the texture that I've created by lifting to be gone. So I'm first going to layer with a pinkish purple color from a mixture of Quin Red, White with a bit of Mineral Violet, and I'm going to start from the top left hand side. And what I try to do is apply the paint right at the center, away from the clouds from either side first. Then as I get closer towards the clouds, I try to use sort of like a dry load that is fairly clean and bring across the paint to the edges. And the dry brush texture will give this uneven texture, which will help the new layer of paint to blend with the rest of the sky and the softer edge of the clouds. And hopefully you can see what I mean from this close-up. So as I get closer to the clouds, I dry my brush and pull the rest of the paint towards the edges of the clouds with the dry brush. I like to do this in sections because I don't want those edges to dry. If not, it'll leave that sharp edge that you can see if I'm applying the paint on top of dry paper. And doing small sections at a time will give you enough time for each of those sections to keep the moisture before moving on to the next area, as the colors will connect with each other. And in terms of color, I just added more cerulean blue towards the bottom of the sky. After this, you can do final touch-ups depending on the stage of your painting. For me, I'm going to add a bit of buff titanium as well as clean out some of the cloud shapes, and once I'm ready with the sky in general, I'm going to move on to the gouache paints for the final detail of the painting. Now I'm going to get my gouache paints ready for the stars and the crescent moon. I'm putting a tiny bit of primary yellow first, and this is only a very tiny bit with a lot of white. You can just do white by itself, but I really like the light tint of yellow against the purple and pinks and blues, as the yellow complements those colors very well. I added a bit of water just so the paint is not too thick, but I don't want too much water that it loses its opacity. I'm going to paint the crescent moon first because this will be the focal point of the painting, and I want to make sure that it's positioned well. If you're uncomfortable with painting this free-handedly, you can also try to draw it with pencil first, but you have to make sure that the paper is completely bone dry before you do that. If not, you might damage the paper with either the pencil or the eraser if you're going to erase certain mistakes. I made the center of the moon a bit lighter, and with a dry load I try to create a bit of texture so the crescent moon doesn't look too flat. Then I go over the sides again with more paint to make it more visible. Then with the same paint, I'm just going to tap two brushes together to create splatters for the stars. Some of the splatters might land on the clouds or parts that you don't want them to land. So what I like to do is just to pick it up with either my brush to blend it in with the rest of the clouds, or to use tissue to take it off. I like to also enlarge some of the stars, so if the paint is still wet, I'm just going to spread it out a bit more to create a larger dot. And I'm just going to do this randomly, so there are differences in size with the stars, and I feel like this gives a bit more depth. I've also noticed that the moon isn't popping out as much as I want to, so I'm going to add the same background color of the purple to layer on more paint around the moon. And as I get closer to the clouds, I'm going to follow the same method as before by spreading it out with a dry brush. I'm not even too worried if I don't reach the edges of the clouds. I just want the surrounding background of the moon to be darker to give it more contrast. Now, using the same color as the stars, I'm going to create larger stars with a cross and two diagonal lines going across of each other, and this will create more of a sparkly looking star. I'm just going to repeat this a few times, and this will just depend on your taste how much you want to incorporate this into your painting. To give it a softer look, I like to soften the tip, so I tend to pull the ends out further, and this will create more of a glowing effect. I'm also going to layer more of the opaque white to exaggerate it further. Using the white that I have on my palette, I'm just going to layer on more white on the moon, so again the edges have a bit more definition. Then to finish everything off, I'm going to exaggerate the glow of the stars using the bleed-proof white for a very opaque white color. I'm going to add this at the center of the larger stars as well as on some of the dots. Once you're done, just give it one final look. I'm quite happy with what I have here, so I'm just going to unmask it and reveal the painting. And because I used a lot of water for this painting, the paper was still a bit limp and warped, so I ended up ironing the backside to dry it as well as to straighten it. And that's pretty much it for this painting. Like usual, all of the tools as well as my social media links will be listed in the description box. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!